What if I told you that the world's first officially Christian nation wasn't Rome, wasn't Constantinople, and wasn't even in the Middle East where Christianity began? What if the most pivotal moment in Christian political history happened on a fog-shrouded island at the edge of the known world, declared by a warrior king whose very name meant Great Light? Today, we're diving into one of history's most overlooked stories, how King Lucius of Britain made a decision in 156 AD that would echo through the centuries and challenge everything you thought you knew about early Christianity. Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history, and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe, and share. Help build my channel, and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. Picture this: it's the year 140 AD. The last of Jesus' original disciples have passed away. Saint John, who had outlived all the others, finally died at the remarkable age of 101. Joseph of Arimathea, who had brought Christianity to Britain decades earlier, was long gone, having died around 82 AD at the sacred site of Avalon. The founding generation, those who had walked with Christ or learned directly from those who had, were now just memories. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried the torch forward into an uncertain future. But what a torch they carried! In just 66 years after Christ's death, this handful of believers had accomplished what seemed impossible. Armed with nothing but faith and the promise of salvation, they had conquered the mightiest empire the world had ever known. Not through swords or armies, but through conviction. Christian centers had sprouted across the known world like wildfire, from Jerusalem to Athens, from Alexandria to Spain, from the islands of Cyprus and Crete to the great cities of Asia Minor. And at the heart of this explosion of faith stood Britain. While Rome persecuted Christians and forced them into the catacombs, Britain had become something extraordinary, a safe haven, a fortress of faith. From the legendary site of Avalon, an endless stream of missionaries poured forth into Gaul, Germany, Switzerland, and Rome itself. British Christians didn't just participate in the spread of the gospel, they led it. They were the backbone of the early church's expansion into Europe. But let's get back to our story, because by 137 AD, something significant was brewing in Britain. A young prince named Eurygemower was about to step onto history's stage. His uncle, Saint Timotheus, the son of the famous Claudia and Pudens of Rome, made a special journey from the Eternal City to Winchester. There, in a ceremony that would change everything, he baptized his nephew and consecrated him as defender of the faith, making him the rightful successor to King Arviragus, who had originally received this honor from Joseph of Arimathea himself. Who was this young prince? His Roman name was Lucius, derived from the Latin word for light, lux. But his Celtic name told you everything you needed to know about him, Luvermower, meaning the Great Light. To the Romans, he was the Great Luminary. And his bloodline, simply put, it was extraordinary. Through his father Coel, he could trace his ancestry directly back to the legendary British heroes Caractacus and Arviragus. This wasn't just any king, this was a man who carried the blood of Britain's greatest warriors and its most devoted Christian monarchs. Lucius chose to make his royal seat at Winchester, and even this choice reveals something profound. Winchester had been founded around 500 BC by Dunwall Molmutius, one of the three wise British kings, a brilliant lawmaker who had created the city on an ancient Druidic sacred site. Known as the White City, for its distinctive chalk walls, Winchester represented continuity with Britain's pre-Christian past while embracing its Christian future. It was so significant that centuries later, William the Conqueror refused to consider his first coronation legitimate until he was crowned a second time at Winchester, believing that only there could one truly claim the British throne. Now, here's where our story reaches its climax. The year was 156 AD. King Lucius convened a national council at Winchester. What happened next would reverberate through history. In an act of unprecedented boldness, Lucius officially proclaimed Christianity as the national faith of Britain. Not just his personal faith. Not just the faith of the court. The national faith, by act of parliament, declared before the entire realm. Let that sink in for a moment. This was the year 156 AD. The Roman Empire, the most powerful force on earth, was still viciously pagan and actively persecuting Christians. Believers in Rome were being thrown to lions in the Colosseum for entertainment. The catacombs were filled with Christians hiding in fear. And yet, here was Lucius, standing before his council in Winchester, officially declaring that Britain, as a nation, was Christian. The British Triads, those ancient records of Welsh history, preserve the exact wording of this momentous declaration. King Lucius was the first in the Isle of Britain who bestowed the privilege of country and nation and judgment and validity of oath upon those who should be of the faith of Christ. In simple terms, Lucius wasn't just saying Christians were tolerated or even welcome. He was saying that Christianity was woven into the very fabric of British law, governance, and national identity. This wasn't just important, it was revolutionary. Yes, his great-grandfathers Caractacus and Arviragus had been Christian kings, but they had ruled during a different era. Their time had been about survival, about converting their people, about organizing the church, and about defending against Roman persecution. They had fought 60 major battles against Rome between 43 and 86 AD. They had bled to protect the faith. But they couldn't yet make the declaration that Lucius now made. The timing was finally right. The great Roman commander Agricola, having experienced British military prowess firsthand, had wisely shifted strategy. Rather than continuing the futile attempt to conquer Britain, he recognized the Britons as allies of the Roman Empire, preserving all their native freedoms and royal prerogatives. Emperor Hadrian expanded this treaty in 120 AD. The Romans could maintain certain military bases, but Britain remained sovereign. This peace would last until around 300 AD, and it created the perfect conditions for Lucius's declaration. The Christian world erupted in celebration. Finally, after over a century of persecution, prayer, and martyrdom, one nation had officially taken a stand. A writer named Sabellius, recording events around 250 AD, captured it perfectly. Christianity was privately confessed elsewhere, but the first nation that proclaimed it as their religion, and called itself Christian, after the name of Christ, was Britain. Another historian, Gennebrand, put it even more powerfully: the glory of Britain consists not only in this, that she was the first country which in a national capacity publicly professed herself Christian, but that she made this confession when the Roman Empire itself was pagan and a cruel persecutor of Christianity. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Fast forward several centuries, and the Roman Catholic Church began making a rather extraordinary claim. They asserted that this epochal moment, this historic declaration by Lucius, was actually brought about by Pope Eleutherius in Rome. They tried to rewrite history, to claim credit for what had happened in Britain. But there's a glaring problem with this claim: nobody in Rome mentioned it for over 400 years. Not a single allusion to papal involvement appears until after 597 AD, when the Italian Augustinian mission arrived in Britain. That's more than 440 years after Lucius's declaration. If Rome had truly orchestrated this world-changing event, why the centuries of silence? The answer is obvious to anyone looking at the evidence objectively. Britain's decision was made independently, courageously, and in defiance of Roman paganism, not because of Roman Christianity. The later attempts to claim credit reveal more about medieval church politics than they do about historical reality. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Why does the story of King Lucius matter today, nearly 2,000 years later? First, it reminds us that the early church was far more diverse and decentralized than we often imagine. Rome wasn't always the center. In fact, during Christianity's most vulnerable years, it was places like Britain, protected by warrior kings and fierce believers, that kept the faith alive and spread it across Europe. Second, it challenges us to consider what genuine faith looks like. Those early Christians, led by kings like Lucius, didn't have the luxury of casual belief. Their faith cost them something. It defined their laws, their culture, their national identity. They didn't just attend church when it was convenient, they built their entire civilization around their convictions. Finally, it's a reminder that courage at the right moment can change the world. Lucius could have waited. He could have kept his faith private. He could have avoided making waves while Rome was still hostile. But instead, he stood up at the National Council in Winchester and declared to the world, Britain is a Christian nation. And in doing so, he gave hope to persecuted believers throughout the Roman Empire and set in motion events that would ultimately transform the entire Western world. The question we started with was, what happened when Britain became the world's first Christian nation? The answer is profound. One king's courage created a beacon of hope in a dark world, proving that faith, when boldly proclaimed and genuinely lived, could indeed move mountains and change the course of history forever. That's the story of Lucius, the Great Light, the king who dared to stand alone so that millions would never have to stand alone again. Imagine standing before the most powerful religious figure in medieval Europe. He demands your submission. He claims divine authority over your church, your kingdom, your soul. And you, representing a small island nation on the edge of the known world, look him straight in the eye and say, "We have nothing to do with Rome." This isn't fiction. This happened. And the story behind it reveals one of history's greatest cover-ups, a deliberate falsification of the historical record that has shaped how we understand the spread of Christianity for over 1,000 years. Here's the question that will drive everything we explore today. What if Britain didn't need Rome to bring Christianity to its shores? What if, in fact, Britain was already a thriving Christian nation, sending out its own missionaries, building grand cathedrals, and establishing theological schools, more than 4 centuries before the Roman Catholic Church even existed? The evidence suggests exactly that. And the proof comes not from British propaganda, but from Rome's own archives, from the pens of Roman Catholic scholars, and from a single letter written in the year 183 AD that the Vatican couldn't quite erase from history. Welcome to a story of ancient faith, political manipulation, and the British bishops who refused to bow. The year is approximately 603 AD. Saint Augustine, not the famous African theologian, but Augustine of Canterbury, has arrived in Britain on a mission from Rome. His task is clear: bring the British Church under papal control. The Pope wants submission. Augustine expects compliance. But when Augustine meets with the British bishops for the first time, something extraordinary happens. These aren't primitive pagans grateful for enlightenment. These are educated, confident church leaders who've been governing their own Christian communities for centuries. And they're insulted by Augustine's presumption. The British bishops deliver a statement that echoes through history: "We have nothing to do with Rome. We know nothing of the Bishop of Rome in his new character of the Pope. We are the British Church, the Archbishop of which is accountable to God alone, having no superior on earth." Augustine is stunned. His Roman entourage is furious. How dare these backwater Britons reject the authority of Rome? But here's what makes this moment so significant: the British bishops weren't rebels rejecting legitimate authority. They were defending something far older than papal claims, a Christian tradition that had existed in Britain since the 1st century, established by direct disciples of Christ himself. Sir William Blackstone, the legendary English legal scholar, would later write that the ancient British Church was a stranger to the Bishop of Rome and all his pretended authorities. Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher and historian, documented how the Britons told Augustine they would not be subject to him, nor let him pervert the ancient laws of their church. Bacon noted that they maintained their church's liberty for 500 years after Augustine's arrival, making Britain the last of all the churches of Europe that gave up the power to the Roman beast. But why were the British so confident? What gave them the audacity to reject Rome? The answer lies buried in the historical record, a record that Augustine and his successors worked desperately to obscure. Let's travel back to May 28, in the year 137 AD. On this spring day, a young British prince named Lucius kneels in the sacred waters of Chalice Well, at the foot of Glastonbury Tor. His uncle, St. Timotheus, baptizes him into the Christian faith. This isn't a conversion by Roman missionaries. This is a family affair. Christianity has already been established in Britain for a full century, brought by Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy disciple who provided the tomb for Jesus' burial, and possibly by the Apostle Paul himself during his missionary journeys. By the time Lucius becomes king, he doesn't need Rome to tell him about Jesus. He's been raised in the faith. And in 156 AD, he does something remarkable: he officially declares Britain a Christian nation. The entire kingdom, 27 years before he ever contacts Rome. To commemorate his baptism, Lucius builds a magnificent church in 167 AD, St. Michael's, constructed on the summit of Glastonbury Tor, the most sacred Druidic site in all of Britain. The symbolism is powerful. Christianity has not just arrived, it has taken root and displaced the old religion at its very heart. 3 years later, in 170 AD, Lucius founds what will become Winchester Cathedral, one of the most majestic churches in Christian history. This building still stands today, housing the tombs of England's greatest warriors and treasures like the casket of Alfred the Great's grandfather. Here's what's crucial: all of this, the baptism, the nationalization, the grand cathedrals, happens decades before meaningful contact with Rome. Britain is already thoroughly, officially, magnificently Christian. So when does Rome enter the picture? In 183 AD, 27 years after Britain became a Christian nation, King Lucius sends 2 emissaries, Medway and Elvan, on a diplomatic mission to Rome. And here's where the historical falsification begins. Roman Catholic writers would later claim that Lucius was pleading with Rome to send missionaries to convert him and his pagan kingdom. They portrayed this as Britain begging for the light of Christianity from the superior Roman Church. But the actual correspondence between Lucius and Eleutherius, the Bishop of Rome, tells a completely different story. And it's this letter, preserved despite centuries of attempts to rewrite its meaning, that destroys the Roman narrative. Lucius isn't asking to be converted. Britain doesn't need missionaries. Instead, Lucius is asking for something much more mundane. He wants some of his British missionaries back. You see, British Christians had been sent to Rome to help Bishop Eleutherius evangelize within the Roman Empire. Britain was exporting Christian teachers, not importing them. But now Lucius needs them home to expand his already thriving Christian programs in Britain. 6 major historians confirm this account and the 183 AD date: Gildas, Geoffrey of Monmouth, the Venerable Bede, Urban, John of Teignmouth, and remarkably, Capgrave, described as the most learned of English Augustinians. Even members of Roman Catholic orders acknowledged that Britain's version of events was true. But the most damning evidence comes from Eleutherius himself. The Bishop of Rome's letter to King Lucius, preserved by John Fox in his famous Acts and Monuments, reveals everything Rome tried to hide. Eleutherius writes, "Ye have received of late through God's mercy in the realm of Britain the law and faith of Christ. Ye have within you within the realm both the parties of the Scriptures." Read that carefully. Eleutherius acknowledges that Britain already has the Christian faith. He confirms that Britain possesses the complete Scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. He's not writing to a pagan king he's converting. He's corresponding with an established Christian monarch. Then Eleutherius says something even more remarkable: "Ye be God's vicar in your kingdom." He's calling Lucius God's representative in Britain. No mention of papal authority. No claim that Lucius must submit to Rome. Instead, a Roman bishop acknowledging a British king's spiritual authority in his own realm. This is a primary source, a contemporary document written at the time of the events it describes. It's infinitely more reliable than histories written centuries later, and it completely contradicts the Roman Catholic narrative that Rome brought Christianity to Britain. If you would like further context and the rest of the story, check out previous videos and future videos. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources or find resources in description. If you have book sources or links of your own on this subject, please share in comments or email me. Thank you. So why don't more people know this story? Because Augustine and his successors embarked on a systematic campaign of historical revisionism. They deliberately confused dates, attributed false meanings to correspondence, and created an entirely fictional narrative about British Christianity's origins. Even the term Pope itself is part of the deception. Roman Catholic writers developed the habit of calling all early bishops of Rome Pope, even though this title didn't exist until the year 610 AD, when the Emperor Phocas created the office as political revenge against a rival bishop. Gregory I, who sent Augustine to Britain, was never actually pope. He was simply Bishop of Rome, and he specifically refused the title when it was offered to him. But by retroactively calling early Roman bishops pope, Catholic writers created the illusion of an ancient, continuous papal authority that never actually existed during the time of the apostles or the early church. The British bishops understood this deception. That's why they told Augustine they know nothing of the Bishop of Rome in his new character of the Pope. They recognized papal claims as the innovation they were. Cardinal Baronius, a high-ranking Roman Catholic scholar with access to the Vatican archives, examined the records and concluded that the Augustinian claims were false. He provided a detailed chronological account from 36 AD onward that confirmed British priority in Christianity. Even from within the Roman Catholic Church, honest scholars acknowledged the truth: Britain didn't receive Christianity from Rome. Britain had Christianity first. Consider the evidence that even Rome couldn't suppress. When Lucius's emissaries returned from Rome in 183 AD, they brought back two British missionaries, Duvan and Fagan. Both had been educated at Avalon, the ancient Christian school founded by Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury. These weren't Romans teaching Britons, these were Britons who had been teaching Romans, now returning home. Elvan, one of the emissaries, was himself a product of this ancient British Christian tradition. Pitseus, a Roman Catholic canon, documented that Elvan was brought up at Glastonbury and was educated in the school of St. Joseph of Arimathea. This isn't British mythology, this is Roman Catholic scholarship confirming apostolic age Christianity in Britain. Elvan would go on to become the second Bishop of London and the first prelate of St. Peter's of Cornhill, a church that King Lucius built and that remains famous in London to this day, physical proof of 2nd century British Christianity. The story of British Christianity matters because it reveals how easily history can be rewritten by those with power and institutional interests. For centuries, the official narrative claimed that civilization and faith flowed from Rome to the barbarian periphery. Britain was cast as a backward island rescued from darkness by Roman enlightenment. But the documentary evidence, preserved in letters, confirmed by multiple historians, corroborated by physical structures still standing today, tells a different story. Christianity didn't flow from Rome to Britain. It arrived in Britain directly from the Holy Land in the 1st century, carried by disciples who knew Jesus personally. What if the most important Christian king in British history has been completely erased from our collective memory? A monarch who built the first churches in London, minted the first coins bearing the cross, and established the foundations of British Christianity over a century before Constantine, yet today, his name means nothing to most people. Who was King Lucius, and why has history forgotten the man who transformed an entire nation's faith? Stay with us as we uncover one of Christianity's greatest untold stories. The year is 179 AD, and something extraordinary is happening in ancient Britain. King Lucius, ruler of the Britons, is about to reshape the religious landscape of his entire kingdom. But this story doesn't begin with the king himself. It starts with three remarkable men who would carry his vision forward: Bishops Elvan, Duvan, and Fagan. These weren't just any religious appointees. Elvan, in particular, had a fascinating backstory. Before his elevation to bishop, he had led a congregation of Christian Culdees at Glastonbury, that mystical place the ancient Britons called Avalon. But here's what makes his story even more compelling. Elvan was educated at the school founded by none other than Saint Joseph of Arimathea himself, yes, the same Joseph who, according to tradition, took care of Christ's body after the crucifixion. The Roman Catholic canon Pittacus documented Elvan's journey in his work, Relationes Historici de Rebus Anglicis, noting that this Elvanus of Avalon had even written an informative work about the origins of the British Church. When Elvan succeeded Theonas as the second Bishop of London around 185 AD, he became the first prelate to serve in a brand new church, St. Peter's of Cornhill. This wasn't just any church. It was built by King Lucius himself in memory of Saint Peter, and it would remain famous throughout the centuries of Christian history. But let's rewind a bit. What drove these three bishops, Elvan, Duvan, and Fagan, to journey from Winchester to the sacred Isle of Avalon? They shared King Lucius's deep affection for this holy place and sought to restore it to its original conception as founded by Saint Joseph and his 12 companions. When they arrived at Avalon, they discovered something extraordinary. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the medieval historian, documented what they found with vivid detail. Let me share his words. There, God leading him, they found an old church built, as 'twas said, by the hands of Christ's disciples, and prepared by God himself for the salvation of souls, which church the heavenly builder himself showed to be consecrated by many miraculous deeds, and many mysteries of healing. Geoffrey continued, describing how they learned that the Lord had specially chosen this spot before all the rest of Britain as the place where his mother's name might be invoked. Ancient writings revealed the full story, how Saint Philip had come to France with disciples and sent 12 of them into Britain to preach. These 12 had constructed a chapel that the Son of God later dedicated to honor his mother, and each received portions of land for their sustenance. The 3 bishops were so moved by this discovery that they made a profound decision. They would honor the memory of those original 12 missionaries by selecting 12 of their own companions to live on the island. With King Lucius's approval, these 12 lived as anchorites, hermits scattered across the island, yet they would regularly gather in that old church to celebrate divine worship together. As Geoffrey recorded, this practice continued during many years up to the coming of St. Patrick, the Apostle of the Irish. Now, here's where the story takes a truly remarkable turn. King Lucius had been in correspondence with Eleutherius, the Bishop of Rome, what we'd call the Pope today. In his famous letter to Lucius, Eleutherius did something unprecedented in Christian history. He named Lucius the Vicar of God. Think about that for a moment. This was the first time that title had ever been bestowed on any king, anywhere. And it was given to a British king by the Bishop of Rome himself. By this act, the Church at Rome was essentially declaring that Lucius, not themselves, was the head of the Church. But here's what makes Lucius truly exceptional: he refused the title. He didn't accept or use this honorary designation. Why? Because he recognized what the bishops of the British Church and all Christian Britons understood, that Christ alone was the head of the Church and the true representative of the Father. Instead, Lucius accepted the title, the most religious king, a designation that every British ruler since has held when sitting on the British throne. Lucius's building campaign was nothing short of revolutionary. In 179 AD, he established 3 major archbishoprics at London, York, and Killeen-on-Usk, creating the foundational structure of British church hierarchy. That same year, he built the historic St. Peter upon Cornhill in London, installing Elvan as its first bishop. What's fascinating is that we know exactly what this church represented because a historical tablet from its original walls survived the Great Fire of London in 1666, a fire that almost completely leveled the ancient city. That tablet, preserved over the mantel of a fireplace in the vestry, tells us everything. It reads, "Be it known to all men that the year of our Lord God 179, Lucius, the first Christian king of the land, then called Britain, founded the first church in London, that is to say, the Church of St. Peter upon Cornhill." The inscription continues, noting that Lucius founded there an archbishop's see and made the church the metropolitan and chief church of the kingdom, and that this arrangement endured for 400 years until St. Augustine arrived. It even records that the years of his reign were 77 years. But Lucius didn't stop with London. He founded churches at Llandaff, at Cardiff, still referred to today as Lucius's Church, and the beautiful St. Mary de Lode in Gloucester, where he would eventually be laid to rest. The Cardiff Church, known as St. Mellors, maintains its connection to the king's legacy even in modern times. Now, here's a historical correction that needs to be made. It's commonly stated that Emperor Constantine was the first to stamp the sign of the cross on coins. That's wrong. King Lucius, Constantine's own ancestor, was actually the first. He minted coins displaying the cross on one side and his name, Luke, on the other. 2 of these remarkable coins still exist in the British Museum collection today. This detail reveals something deeper about British resistance to Roman culture. Arviragus, Lucius's maternal ancestor, had been so bitterly opposed to Rome that he made acceptance or circulation of Roman coins among the British a capital offense. This wasn't just economic policy, it was a statement of independence. From Emperor Claudius, whom Arviragus first battled, through Emperor Hadrian's reign, no Roman imperial coins are found in Britain. The British Museum's collection substantiates this notable omission. It wasn't until Hadrian that Roman coinage finally appeared in complete series. The coins of these British kings were magnificent. An eminent numismatic expert once remarked, "Wherever a coin of the British King Arviragus is shown in any coin collection, it stands out as a gem." And here's an interesting detail. All these coins, from Arviragus, from Cunobelinus with his galloping charger and 3 ostrich feathers, and from Lucius, were minted at Colchester, that quiet little city that historians often overlook despite its massive startling history. So why don't we know about King Lucius? It's baffling, really. John Fox, in his famous Acts and Monuments, wrote that Lucius, after he had founded many churches, and given great riches and liberties to the same, deceased with great tranquillity in his own land, and was buried at Gloucester. Yet of all the great disciples of Christ, Lucius is probably the least known. To the average person, his name has no meaning. Historians bypass him as though he never existed, despite the wealth of information describing his life and achievements. King Lucius died on December 3 in the year 201 AD, after a long reign of 77 years. The learned Alban butler documented that he was first buried at St. Mary de Lode in Gloucester, then later reinterred at St. Peter's upon Cornhill, the church for which he held such deep affection. Eventually, his remains were translated back to Gloucester, placed in the choir of the Franciscan Church, the Church of the Grey Friars, by the Earls of Berkeley and Clifford. The historical documentation is extensive. Bede, Nennius, Elvan himself, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Cressy, William of Malmesbury, Usher, who consulted 23 different works on Lucius, Rhys, Baronius, Alford, the Book of Llandaff, the Welsh Triads, the Mabinogion, and many other reliable sources all pay noble tribute to this Christian monarch. Yet the Christian world has forgotten him. But here's what makes this story truly powerful: the lasting impact of Lucius's achievements endured for well over a century after his death. The people and the land thrived in peace and prosperity. The Venerable Bede, writing in 740 AD, summed it up eloquently: the Britons preserved the faith which they had nationally received under King Lucius uncorrupted and entire, and continued in peace and tranquillity until the time of the Emperor Diocletian. When Diocletian's savage persecution finally broke that peace, it produced Constantine the Great, a direct descendant of Lucius, Arviragus, and Caractacus. The seed of faith that Lucius planted never perished. It endured from one generation to another, coursing beneath calm waters in times of peace, ready to crash to the surface during stormy conflict whenever the precious heritage needed defending. And here's the remarkable thing: in every case, it was a prince of royal blood who stood forth to meet the challenge, always a true lineal descendant of those valiant British kings and queens. That unbroken chain continues today, representing an unbroken link spanning nearly 2 millennia. So we return to our opening question: why has history forgotten King Lucius? Perhaps it's because his story challenges what we think we know about Christianity's spread through Europe. Perhaps acknowledging his achievements complicates our tidy narratives about Constantine being the first Christian emperor. Or perhaps, in our rush to celebrate the familiar names, we've overlooked one of Christianity's greatest heroes, a king who devoted his entire life as a disciple in Christ's service, establishing a foundation of faith so strong that it endured for centuries and continues to this day. The next time you hear about Constantine and the Christianization of the Roman Empire, remember King Lucius. Remember the 3 bishops who restored Avalon. Remember the churches, the coins bearing the cross, and the unbroken line of faith that runs from ancient Britain to the present day. Some stories deserve to be forgotten. This isn't one of them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.